So this Sicha Tetzave Zayin Adar is based on two Farbrengens, Tetzave and Kisisa Tavshin Chav Zayin. And the Shabbos of Shabbos Tetzave, the Rebbe started off with a mimer, Sisa Mizbeach Miktar Teres. Then the Rebbe continued like this. We spoke about the mimer based on what the Tetzave says, and that's that tightness of Zayin Adar. You fast in the Shana Mubarak, you fasted on the first month on Adar Rishon. And also in that mimer, it speaks about the difference between Zayin Adar and Lag Baomer. Fascinating. And Zayin Adar, it has to be in Yanatainis. Mash Enken Lag Baomer is Yem Elula de Rashbi, Yem Simcha. Now the question is, what's the difference? Why is one a Yem Simcha and one's a Rashbi? Now a peep shot, there is the various answers. An example in Yaris Tvasha, Rabbi and Eipshitz, that it was based on the will of the Balei Lula. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to pass away, he didn't want Nistalkus, and therefore his passing is Yematainis. However, the Rashbi made it a day Simcha, so therefore it is Abdacha. The Rebbe says, but that itself is not understood. Why, if we're talking about Adoya Yisrael and Adoya Neman, the focus is on Am Yisrael, so Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want it, obviously it's because he felt it was the betterment of Am Yisrael. So why Rashbi felt otherwise? Especially that we know that Rashbi was a spark of Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore we have the answer of the Tzemach Tzedek. Now the answer of the Tzemach Tzedek is brought in Kuntrasei Shtachus. I just did a bit of research, and the Rebbe one time spoke about it in the Farbrengen on Yud Shvat Tavshin Yud Tes. The Rebbe over there spoke, this was the 9th yard site, and the Rebbe was talking about that what it talks about in the mimer, that when a tzaddik passes away, it's an incredible awakening from below. It's like this deep that comes from below, and shines, and therefore it's a Yom Simcha. And Rebbe says this explains, basically, he's explaining the Tzemach Tzedek, the difference between Moshe Rabbeinu and Rashbi. The Rashbi, Zayin Adar, that Moshe Rabbeinu's Adar, Zayin Adar is Yom Tainus, and Lag Baomer is Simcha. Why? Because in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, as well as the time of the Mishkan when the Yidden were in Bnei Yisrael, so there was Gilu Yalikus, so there was the ultimate unity of Kuchav Lichu Shchinte, the ultimate unity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in all the levels, and therefore you didn't have to have a special yichud that happened by tzaddikim when they pass away, when they're nostalgic. Because compared to the yichud of Kuchav Lichu within itself, there's nothing in comparison, so therefore it's not a big hilul, it's not a big simcha that the tzaddik's histalkus caused the yichud. However, histalkus Rashbi, which was in the time of Galus, because we know that Rashbi was in the time that the Romans ruled over Am Yisrael after the Churban Abayis, Galus Remi. So it was not the level of Shleimus HaYichud of Kuchav Lichu itself, and therefore the Yichud only happened through tzaddikim when they're nostalgic, and therefore it's called a Hilula. Then the Rebbe said, so seemingly it should be a Hilula in the stalkus of all the tzaddikim, and the Rebbe explained that in order to accomplish Hilula, you need a chibur, you need a composition of two things. You have to have a pnimius, and you have to, in other words, it has to be a pool of pnimius, not just external, and it has to be begilul, which is kind of a paradox. And that was only able to be accomplished by tzaddikim who were able to accomplish this incredible level. They took dozen to dozen, and they brought it out in the most unbelievable chutzah. And that is why only by Yechidei Skula, by specific people, do we find the issue, the inyan of that the Yom Stalkus is an incredible day of Simcha. Then the Rebbe went into the whole Sikha that we spoke about, the Zayin Adar to Yom Tainus because of Mrs. Moshe, etc., even though it's an inyan of Simcha, because the day of Zayin Adar is not because it's a Yom Chayev, but rather Mitzadat Tshuva v'Chayit na Levi, and that even brings more Simcha. Then the Rebbe said, in our days we don't fast in Zayin Adar besides the weakening of the Dor, but you have to give tzedakah instead of the tainus. And the Rebbe says more. We know the Minig Rebbe saying the Sienu that they wouldn't say Tachlin and Zayin Adar, and they definitely didn't have tainus. Why? Because the Indian of the Rebbe saying the Sienu is the expansion of Moshe in each generation, and the spark of Moshe Rabbeinu is that Bashkach Aptadas, they were appointed to be the heads of Bnei Yisrael. that everything in Bnei Yisrael goes through them, like Perek Beis Tanya says, and that's the Keach of Moshe. He's the first Gedolei Yisrael, and he gives the Keach to the Nasi of every generation. And therefore, for the Nasi, Zayin Adar is a Yom Simcha, and they don't say Tachnan. Even though Moshe Rabbeinu himself didn't want the stalkers of Zayin Adar, that was only in the beginning. But after there was the stalkers of Zayin Adar, then something great happened. Even though Moshe Rabbeinu was an incredible level, even before that he wasn't able to be with a woman. Hashem says, nevertheless, he achieved an incredible level. He reached the Shad Hanun. And therefore, this idea is also plays out in every single Nasi, and therefore the Zayin Adar is a Yom Simcha, not only for the Iskashrus of the Moshe, but for each and every one of us. Do the Iskashrus, and the Iskashrus that's not only in Machshava Dibra, but also in Maisa, that we're able to connect to the power and energy of the stay and through the Yavatzlacha and every single thing that you knew. Then I'm tempted to continue into the Farbrengen that's not so connected. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, the Maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek. So in that Maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek, it spoke about sfichim, things that something that grows misalusa l'sata. And based on what we learned, we can understand something else. We know that when the Mittel Rebbe wanted to set up a settlement in Eretz Yisrael, he asked the Chassidim to go there. They asked what's going to be in Chassidus. Now, truth is, they didn't even live with the Tzemach Tzedek. They would come, but they would come once in a while to hear Chassidus, or they would the Mittel Rebbe. The story happened with the Mittel Rebbe, or the Mittel Rebbe would go travel to them. But now they won't be able to hear Chassidus. And what did the Mittel Rebbe say? He'll send them bichla, confessing. And Rebbe says this is the simple reason why, if you look at the collection of the Frierdiker Rebbe, you see there's very few handwritten ksavim of the Mittel Rebbe. Why? I mean, L'chada, he wrote even more than the other Rabbi. We know he wrote a lot because he sent it to Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, by the descendants of the Chassidim Admor that traveled to Eretz Yisrael, we found a lot of the Chassidus of the Mittel Rebbe. I'm not sure why I'm saying Tzemach Tzedek, the Mittel Rebbe. Now, L'chada, it's not understood. Even though the Mittel Rebbe promised to send them Chassidus, nevertheless, they were lacking in Echa Loisis Meirecha. And this is an incredible level. And the Rebbe goes on and on and on about it. So how could he say that the Bichlach is enough? So he says we can understand it based on what we're saying about the Sfiach. Now, I'm looking for the exact translation of Sfiach. They're translating it as aftergrowth, but I don't think what it means. Basically, the Rebbe says, even though this Via happened a long time ago, the planting, and now there was no planting, nevertheless, there is aftergrowth. So there's still growth that happens much later, and that leads to more stuff and more stuff and more stuff. And eventually you cannot even figure out if what's growing is coming from the original planting or from the aftergrowth, like we see about Sfiche Shviz, Shemitah, etc. So the Rebbe says, so too, that's the Sfiach. The idea is that when you travel somewhere else, even though you don't see anything, because you have the memory of the past, it's like a Sfiach, and it causes the growth now. In other words, literally, you don't have to go back to the source. The aftergrowth causes a growth. Then the Rebbe continued this Farbrengen on Shabbos Pashas Ki Sisa. The Rebbe was talking about over there, Mishenichnas Adar Marvin B'Simcha. And then the Rebbe said over there, we know that it says it, even though it doesn't say it in the Nabam Shulchan Aruch, it says in the Magen Avraham, and we know how considerate the Alter Rebbe was in the opinion of the Magen Avraham, that B'derech Klal, the Alter Rebbe follows the psak of follows the psakim of the Magen Avraham, and that's the way it stays. So based on that, we could talk about this whole idea of Shnichnas Adar Marvin B'Simcha, and that the Mile of Chodesh Adar is latest Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore they have two Nisim, Purim, and Pesach, because Moshe was Mashiach Shayistol, he took him out of Mitzrayim. And from there we see the Marvin B'Simcha is even in Adar Rishon, and the Rebbe says, you could see it also in the words Mishanichnas. Now, what does it mean, Mishanichnas? We see that the beginning of Chodesh Adar is Adar Rishon. it could have been called Shvat Sheni. Nevertheless, it's called Adar Rishon because it's connected to Adar, and therefore, when's Mishnah Nichnas? In Adar, you have to say in Adar Rishon, not in Adar Sheni. L'chaim u'l'shalom, and yeah.